The women moved in a huddled group, their bodies hunched against the punishing cold, their feet dragging through the knee-high drifts. Each breath burned, every movement was pain, but stopping meant death. Eliza Monroe led the way, though her legs trembled beneath her. She had once walked with pride, with purpose. Now she staggered forward on feet she could no longer feel, her hands curled into stiff claws inside the torn fabric of her gloves. Her lips, cracked and bleeding, pressed together as she threw a glance back at the others. They were falling behind. Maggie Carter, once the strongest among them, had collapsed onto her hands and knees, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Her long auburn hair had frozen to the back of her neck, tiny icicles clinging to the ends. Her face was nearly as pale as the snow beneath her. "We have to keep moving," Eliza urged, her voice barely carrying over the wind. She reached for Maggie's arm, but the woman flinched. "Get up." Maggie's gaze was unfocused, her lips moving without sound. Eliza crouched lower, pressing her forehead against Maggie's, her breath warm against the other woman's frozen skin. "Don't let them win," she whispered. Maggie's fingers twitched, the memory of those who had cast them out flickering across her face. It had been her brother-in-law, Tom, the one who had smiled so easily as he took everything she had. Her husband's land, her home, her dignity, then finally her life, or at least what he had assumed was the last of it. He had tossed her from the house in the dead of winter, like garbage, and she had wandered, stunned, until she found the others. Eliza gave Maggie's arm a sharp tug, and the woman gasped as pain jolted her awake. Together, they forced her to her feet. Not far behind, Rose Gallagher was swaying on her feet, clutching her arms to her chest as if she could will warmth back into her bones. Her usual smirk was long gone, her green eyes filled with something brittle, something on the edge of breaking. She had been a saloon girl once, selling laughter and whiskey smiles, but when the owner decided she was of no more use, he sent her into the cold. He hadn't even pretended to care. "I can't feel my hands," she murmured, though no one could hear her. Beside her, Hannah Porter moved with mechanical determination, her face expressionless, the only sign of her struggle the rigid way she clenched her jaw. Of all of them, she had lost the most. A child, stolen from her arms, ripped away by the very family that had once sworn to protect her. She had begged them, pleaded for mercy, but they had only called her weak, called her a burden. And so, into the storm she went. Sarah Yates was the last, limping behind the others, pressing a shaking hand against her ribs, where she had been kicked before being tossed from her family's cabin. She had fought hard, and they had beaten her harder. A reminder, they had said. A warning to any other woman who thought she could stand against a father's rule. The 5 women had found each other, all discarded by the people who were supposed to love them. A cruel joke played by fate, tying their fates together in this endless winter. None of them knew how far they had walked, how long it had been since the warmth of a fire had kissed their skin. They only knew one thing. They were going to die. Eliza wouldn't let it happen. She forced herself forward, each step in agony she refused to acknowledge. "Keep moving," she said, though her throat was raw, her voice barely more than a whisper. The storm screamed in response, shaking the earth, blurring the horizon until the world was nothing but white. Then came the sound, a low guttural growl. The wind carried it from the darkened trees ahead, a whisper of something that did not belong to the storm. Eliza's heart stilled. Another growl. Closer. Her frozen fingers wrapped around a stick buried beneath the snow, though she knew it was useless. Then she saw them. Eyes, glowing yellow in the twilight, stalking forward on silent paws. Wolves. 1, 2, 3. More hidden in the trees. Their hunger was a living thing, etched into the sharpness of their ribs, the gleam of their fangs. Rose gasped, stepping back, her breath a burst of white mist. Maggie clutched at Eliza's arm. "What do we do?" Eliza didn't answer. She knew there was no fighting this, not in their condition. The wolves had likely been tracking them for hours, waiting for weakness, for collapse. Sarah's breath hitched. "We don't have." A snarl cut through her words as the largest of the wolves lunged. Time slowed. Eliza shoved Maggie aside as the beast leaped for her, its jaws snapping inches from her face. She swung the stick wildly, striking its flank, but the creature barely flinched. The others closed in, circling, their movements careful, practiced. Rose screamed. Hannah stumbled back, hands raised as if she could ward them off with nothing but sheer will. Then, the sharp whistle of an arrow cut through the storm. The lead wolf collapsed mid-leap, its body thudding against the snow. A second arrow, then a third. Shapes moved in the shadows beyond the trees, figures wrapped in thick furs, their faces obscured. Eliza barely had time to process before the remaining wolves fled, vanishing into the storm as quickly as they had come. The figures approached. Warriors. Lakota. Eliza's breath shuddered in her lungs, every part of her trembling with exhaustion. She tried to stand straight, to gather the last shreds of her dignity, but her body betrayed her. One of the warriors, taller than the rest, stepped forward. His dark eyes studied them, his expression unreadable. He said something in Lakota, but Eliza did not understand. Maggie clutched at her, whispering, "What do we do?" Eliza could only stare at the man before her, his fur-lined coat, the bow still gripped in his hand. He had saved them, and now he had the power to decide whether they lived or died. The warrior spoke again, this time in slow, measured English. "You should not be here." Eliza, her body broken, her will stretched thin, could only manage a single word in return. "Help." There was a long silence. The storm raged on around them. But here, in the small space where the wind had momentarily stilled, everything held its breath. Finally, the warrior gave a short nod, gesturing to his companions. The last thing Eliza felt before her knees buckled was strong hands catching her, lifting her away from the snow. Then darkness. Warmth. It came slowly, creeping into Eliza's frozen limbs like the hesitant fingers of spring after a brutal winter. She was floating, or at least it felt that way, her body weightless yet somehow heavy, anchored in exhaustion. The scent of smoke and pine filled her senses, mingled with something herbal, sharp yet soothing. A murmur of voices drifted around her, low and unfamiliar, speaking words she couldn't grasp. Her eyelids fluttered. Dim light filtered through what looked like stretched hide, flickering as shadows moved beyond it. A tent. The realization settled in her mind just as the rest of her body finally responded. Pain surged back, dull but present, a reminder that she was alive, that she had been saved. Eliza inhaled sharply, her breath catching on the lingering ache in her ribs as she tried to sit up. A hand pressed gently but firmly against her shoulder, urging her back down. "You need to rest." The voice was soft yet steady, carrying the weight of authority. Eliza turned her head, her vision adjusting to the face before her. A woman, perhaps in her 30s, knelt beside her, dark hair woven into 2 long braids adorned with small beads. Her features were sharp, yet there was kindness in her deep-set eyes. "Where?" Eliza's voice cracked, her throat dry as dust. "You are safe," the woman said, offering her a small bowl. "Drink." Eliza hesitated, but took it, her hands barely strong enough to lift the bowl to her lips. The liquid was bitter, thick, and earthy, sending warmth spreading through her chest as she swallowed. The woman nodded in approval. "You were close to death. Your friends, too." Eliza's fingers tightened around the bowl. "The others? They are alive." Relief rushed through her, but it was short-lived. Their fate was still uncertain. Footsteps approached. The entrance to the tent shifted, and a man stepped inside. His presence filled the space instantly, broad shoulders wrapped in thick furs, dark eyes assessing. The warrior from the forest. Chaska. His gaze swept over her before settling on the healer. "How is she?" "She will live," the woman, White Fawn, replied. Chaska said nothing for a moment, then turned back to Eliza. "You are in our winter camp. We brought you here when we found you in the storm." His voice was calm, but there was something unreadable beneath it. Eliza met his gaze, forcing herself to sit up straighter. "You saved us." A beat of silence. "Then we did." She could hear the weight of his unspoken words. "But should we have?" Eliza swallowed, forcing herself to hold his stare. "Thank you." Chaska inclined his head slightly, but his expression remained impassive. "You should regain your strength. We will speak more soon." With that, he turned and left, the hide door rustling shut behind him. Eliza let out a slow breath, feeling the exhaustion settle deep in her bones. The days that followed were a blur of slow recovery. The women had been given shelter in separate tents, tended to by White Fawn and the others who knew the ways of healing. Their wounds were treated with salves, their strength rebuilt with warm broth and carefully portioned meals. Maggie was the first to regain herself, her stubbornness refusing to let her remain weak for long. She tested the limits of her body, stretching and pacing inside the tent, muttering curses under her breath about being helpless. Hannah remained quiet, withdrawn. She ate when given food, accepted care without complaint, but her eyes carried a distance, as if part of her was still lost in a storm. Rose, ever the restless spirit, spoke the most, though her words were often edged with a cautious kind of humor. She made jokes about their circumstances, about how she'd never expected to wake up in the care of warriors instead of the afterlife. Sarah, though, was the worst off. She had taken the brunt of the cold, her body weaker than the rest. She hardly spoke, her energy spent on simply staying alive. They were safe, for now. But safety was fragile, and they all knew it. On the third day, White Fawn brought them outside for the first time. The world was endless and white, the snow stretching in every direction, yet within the camp, life bustled. Smoke curled from the tops of tents. Children ran past, laughing despite the cold, and men moved with purpose, tending to the horses, checking supplies. It was a world foreign to them, yet it was clear these people knew how to survive when others could not. Chaska stood near the center of the camp, speaking with two other warriors. His gaze flicked to Eliza as she stepped out, but he said nothing. "Come," White Fawn said. "You need to move or your strength will never return." The women followed her, hesitant at first, but soon the cold became a little less cruel as they walked. Days turned into a week. The women were not idle. Maggie, impatient with recovery, began helping in small ways, fetching water, carrying wood, anything to keep herself from feeling useless. She earned nods of approval from some of the Lakota men, though others still regarded them with caution. Hannah took to sitting with White Fawn, learning the uses of herbs, watching as the healer crushed dried leaves into powders, pressing mixtures into small pouches. Rose found herself drawn to the horses, lingering near the edges of the camp where they were kept. It was there she met an older man who showed her how to braid the horses' manes, how to move without startling them. She listened, for once, without protest. Sarah struggled the most. Her body still weak, she spent most of her time inside, though White Fawn made sure she walked a little each day. It wasn't much, but it was something. Eliza, as always, was the one watching everything. She saw how some of the Lakota people accepted them, how others remained distant, their eyes filled with suspicion. She saw the way Chaska kept his distance, yet always seemed aware of where they were. She saw the way Maggie clenched her fists when she thought of the past, the way Rose laughed but never let herself fully relax, the way Hannah stared into the fire at night, lost in thoughts she never voiced. One evening, as the sky burned red with the setting sun, Chaska approached her. "You learn fast," he said, nodding toward where she had been helping carry firewood. Eliza wiped her hands on her skirts. "We don't have the luxury of not learning." Chaska studied her for a long moment. "You do not belong here." Eliza's heart clenched. "I know. You should have died." She exhaled slowly. "I know that too." He tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. "What do you intend to do?" It was the question she had been asking herself since she woke. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I won't let the people who did this to us believe we simply disappeared." Something flickered in Chaska's eyes. "That will bring trouble." Eliza lifted her chin. "Trouble already found us." For the first time, Chaska almost smiled. He nodded once, then walked away, leaving her standing there, the cold wind biting at her face. That night, as the fire crackled and the others drifted into exhausted sleep, Eliza stared up at the sky, the stars burning bright above her. She didn't know what would come next. But for the first time since she had been cast out, she felt something other than fear. She felt ready. The fire crackled low, its embers glowing against the cold night. The women sat in silence, their faces illuminated by the flickering light, each lost in thought. The warmth of the Lakota camp had given them strength, but it had also given them time to remember. And remembering was dangerous. Eliza turned the knife over in her hands, its edge sharpened to a fine point. It was a gift, though she knew it had not been given lightly. Chaska had placed it in her palm earlier that evening without a word, his gaze steady, his meaning clear. There would come a time to use it. That time was near. Maggie was the first to speak. "We can't stay here forever." Rose let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "No, I reckon not. But going back." She exhaled sharply. "They left us for dead. They won't be happy to see ghosts walk into town. They'll wish we were ghosts when we're through with them." Maggie's voice was hard, her hands clenched in her lap. Hannah rubbed at her wrist absently, her expression unreadable. "We need to think this through. We aren't just walking into town to prove a point. If we go back, it has to mean something." Eliza nodded, her grip tightening around the knife. "It means justice." Sarah, frail but recovering, spoke for the first time. "Justice." She let out a breath, bitter and weary. Or revenge. The question settled heavily over them. Eliza knew what Sarah meant, but there was no room for hesitation now. "Justice," she repeated, as much for herself as for them. "We don't go back just to settle scores. We go back to make sure this doesn't happen again, to show them they don't get to decide when we stop breathing." Maggie let out a breath, steadying herself. "Then we need a plan." The next morning, Chaska stood waiting as the women emerged from their tent. His expression was unreadable as always, but his arms were crossed, his stance firm. "You're leaving." Eliza met his gaze. "We are." Chaska studied them, his dark eyes moving from woman to woman. Finally, he sighed. "You are not ready." Maggie's hands twitched at her sides. "We don't have a choice." Chaska nodded slowly, as if he had expected this. "Then you will not go alone." Eliza blinked, surprised. "You're helping us?" Chaska's lips quirked slightly. "You are stubborn. But you are also right. If you disappear into the world without a trace, the people who did this to you will never answer for their sins." He turned to his warriors, nodding once. "We ride at first light." The journey back was slow, the land stretching wide before them, cold and quiet beneath the weight of what was to come. Every mile they covered brought them closer to the people who had tried to bury them. Maggie rode ahead, her shoulders rigid with barely contained fury. Eliza knew what awaited her in town, the brother-in-law who had stolen her land, the man who had laughed as he threw her to the cold. Rose rode beside her, quieter than usual, her lips pressed together in a thin line. Hannah rode at the back, her gaze drifting to the horizon. She hadn't spoken much since they left. Eliza knew why. Her child. Somewhere in that town, her baby was alive, growing up in the hands of those who had torn them apart. Sarah rode between them all, her grip loose on the reins. She still looked weak, but there was steel in her now, an unshakable core that had not been there before. Eliza rode beside Chaska. "You do not have to do this," he said, his voice low. "I do," she replied. He gave a small nod, and they rode on. By dusk, the town came into view. The familiar sight of wooden buildings and flickering lanterns made Eliza's chest tighten. It looked the same as when they had been cast out, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. They stopped at the edge of town, the Lakota warriors keeping their distance, watching from the shadows. This was their fight. Eliza inhaled deeply. "We do this together." Maggie was the first to step forward. She moved with purpose, her boots striking hard against the frozen ground as she made her way to the center of town. People turned to stare, murmurs rising around them like wind through dry grass. Someone gasped, "It's them." Another whispered they were supposed to be dead. Tom Carter, Maggie's brother-in-law, stepped from the saloon, a mug of ale in his hand. His face went slack at the sight of her. He recovered quickly, scowling. "What the hell is this?" Maggie stood tall. "It's me, Tom. Back from the dead." Tom scoffed, but there was unease in his eyes. "You ain't supposed to be here." "Neither's my land," Maggie shot back. "But you've been keeping it warm for me, haven't you?" Tom's grip tightened on his mug. "You don't get to just come back." Maggie stepped closer, her voice steady. "I was never gone." Rose moved next, striding toward the saloon keeper, the man who had thrown her out when she was no longer useful. "Got anything to say to me?" she asked. The man's face darkened. "You don't belong here." Rose smiled coldly. "I never did I?" Hannah's eyes swept the street, searching. Then she saw them. A woman, standing on the steps of the church, a small boy at her side. Her breath hitched. "Daniel," she whispered. The boy turned, confused, and in that instant, Hannah's resolve hardened. She walked forward, slow, deliberate. The woman on the steps, her sister-in-law, went rigid. "What are you doing here?" the woman hissed. Hannah didn't stop. "Give me my son." The tension in the air thickened. Eliza stepped forward, her voice carrying across the street. "You all thought you could erase us, that you could cast us aside and move on." She swept her gaze over them, meeting familiar faces, faces that had once smiled at them before turning their backs. "But you were wrong." A ripple of unease moved through the gathered crowd. A voice called out from the sheriff's office. "You're causing a disturbance." The sheriff himself stepped onto the porch, one hand resting on his gun. He studied them for a long moment before shaking his head. "You should leave." Sarah, still pale, still weaker than the rest, lifted her chin. "No." Eliza's fingers curled into fists. "You let this happen. You stood by while women were thrown out to die." The sheriff's expression darkened. "That's the way things are." "No." Eliza stepped closer. "That's the way you let them be." A shot rang out. The world shattered into chaos. Maggie dove to the side, her body reacting faster than her mind. Rose pulled a knife from her boot, eyes wild. Chaska and his warriors moved as shadows, quick and decisive. Tom Carter lay on the ground, clutching his leg, his own pistol knocked from his grip. Eliza stood over him, her breath ragged, the smoke from her gun curling in the cold air. Silence fell. The town held its breath. Then, one by one, people turned away. The sheriff hesitated, but then he too stepped back, shaking his head. No one would fight for the men who had tried to bury them. Hannah took another step forward. "Daniel," she whispered again. The boy looked at her, uncertain, but his small fingers curled around hers. It was enough. Eliza inhaled deeply, her heart pounding. They had won, but not in the way she expected. They weren't here for blood. They were here to be seen. And they had been. The wind had shifted. No longer did it howl with the same bitter force that had once carried them into the wilderness, stripping them of warmth, of dignity, of hope. Now it was different, cool, steady, carrying the scent of pine and cold iron, of change. The town lay silent in the wake of their stand, the tension still thick in the air. But the battle had already been decided. Eliza breathed heavily, her fingers still clenched around the grip of her gun. The sharp tang of gunpowder lingered between them and the men who had once claimed power over them. Tom Carter lay in the dirt, his legs slick with blood, his breath coming in short, pained bursts. No one moved to help him. Maggie stood above him, her face unreadable. Once he had been family. Once she had trusted him, believed in the bond they shared. Now there was nothing between them but betrayal and the weight of justice long overdue. "You should have killed me," Tom spat, his voice ragged. His hand twitched toward his fallen pistol, but Maggie pressed her boot against his wrist, grinding it into the dirt. "No," she said quietly. "That's the difference between you and me. I don't throw away life like it's worthless." Tom's lip curled, but his strength was fading. He would never walk the same again. And worse, he knew it. Eliza turned away, scanning the street. People still watched from behind windows and doorways, their faces half-lit by lanterns. Their fear was different now, laced not with horror, but with something deeper, something uncomfortable. They had been forced to look at themselves, to acknowledge what they had allowed to happen. Hannah clutched her son tightly to her chest. His small fingers curled in her hair. He did not cry, though his wide eyes flicked from face to face, trying to make sense of what had unfolded. The woman who had stolen him away, his so-called guardian, stood on the steps of the church, her face pale with disbelief. "He's mine," Hannah said, her voice steady, unshakable. "And I am taking him home." The woman opened her mouth, but the sheriff's voice cut through the air. "She's right." Everyone turned to look at him. He stood at the edge of the street, his shoulders slumped, his expression unreadable. "It was never legal what you did." He exhaled sharply. None of it was. There it was. The quiet admission of guilt. Too little, too late. Hannah clutched her son closer, as if she could shield him from all the things he had lost, all the things she had suffered. She would never forget, but she would move forward. Sarah swayed where she stood, pale and exhausted, but resolute. The fever had taken its toll on her, the journey even more so, but still, she straightened. "What happens now?" The sheriff let out a slow breath, glancing at the people of the town. "That's up to all of you." The silence stretched long and thin, but Eliza knew the answer. It was written in the way no one stepped forward to stop them, in the way the fear had shifted, not toward them, but toward what they represented. Change. No one wanted to face them again. Eliza holstered her gun. "We've said what we needed to say." She looked to the others, their faces lined with exhaustion, with pain, but also something else, relief. They had won, not just by surviving, but by standing, by refusing to disappear. Maggie's gaze lingered on Tom, then she turned away, her chin lifted. "Let's go." One by one, they moved toward their horses. The Lakota warriors, ever watchful, waited at the edge of town, their presence a silent reminder that they had never been alone in this fight. Chaska met Eliza's gaze as she reached for the reins of her horse. Satisfied. Eliza hesitated, then nodded. "For now." He gave a small, knowing smile. "That's the problem with justice. It never lasts long." She exhaled. "No, but it lasts long enough." They rode out of town without looking back. The land stretched before them, untouched and endless. Snow still lay thick upon the earth, but it no longer seemed as merciless as before. There was a path now, one they had carved for themselves, through fire and fury, through pain and perseverance. The sun broke through the clouds, casting long golden rays across the white expanse. It was beautiful in a way Eliza hadn't noticed before. Maggie rode beside her, her grip firm on the reins. "What now?" Eliza glanced at her, then at the others, each of them carrying the weight of what they had endured, what they had reclaimed. "We live," she said simply. They rode on, toward whatever future waited for them beyond the snow.